Hello, everybody, and welcome to our third webinar, our third Badger webinar. And this one's all about building a learning ecosystem with micro-credentials. And I want to really thank all of you for being here today and tuning in. For those of you that can't be with us live, thanks for watching the replay. It's terrific to have you here with us as well. So in our session today, we're going to explore how leaders in higher education are building learning ecosystems with the help of micro-credentials and digital badging. And the focus today is going to be on how they empower students to express skills and competencies all the way from admission to graduation and beyond. During the chat, I'm sure we'll explore how micro-credentials provide a way to develop a unified course and credit structure that can offer timely, flexible, and aligned courses for people of all ages. So sit back and relax, but don't relax too much, because as we go through, I want to encourage you really right from the get-go to put your questions into the chat box. We're going to be coming back to your questions at the tail end of this webinar. And what we've observed, Cheryl and I, is that people have a tendency to wait right until the last minute before they throw their questions in, which doesn't give Cheryl a lot of time to be able to knit some themes together. So as a question occurs to you, please take the time to put that in the chat box, and we will do our very best to get to as many of those individual questions or themes at the end of the webinar. So let me introduce our wonderful panel that we've got today that are going to work with us on this topic. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Donna Kidwell. She is Arizona State University's Chief Information Security and Digital Trust Officer. Prior to her current role, she was Chief Technology Officer for Ed+ and partnered on digital trust initiatives such as ASU's Trusted Learner Network, what we love calling TLN, which explores new and emerging technologies of trust, including identity management, a trusted learner record, reverse transfer with community colleges, which is very appropriate for today's conversation, and course credit exchange. And a wonderful human being and a real thought leader in this space. She's being joined with us today. Hello, Claire. Good to have you. Claire Sullivan is Assistant Vice Chancellor for Innovation in Digital Badges and Micro-Credentials, and an experienced professor and administrator with a demonstrated history of developing and implementing innovative programs. Dr. Sullivan is skilled in digital badging, micro-credential development for workforce development, student engagement, and service learning. And it's been such a pleasure getting to know you, Claire, over the last few months as we've been fellow travelers in this space. And I'm being joined today by my good friend, Dr. Cheryl Grant, who is Badger's Director of Digital Credentialing Strategies and is among the change agents who helped build this wonderful field of micro-credentials, spearheading the Open Badges movement 12 years ago now, Cheryl, with Mozilla and the MacArthur Foundation and Hashtag. And Cheryl, thank you for joining us today. It's terrific to be co-chairing this webinar with you. All right, let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to proceed today. Cheryl's with us now, but very soon she's going to disappear and she's going to be monitoring the chat community, looking for those themes and teasing out those questions. And Cheryl's going to be back later in the webinar to actually put your questions to myself and my fellow panel members. I'm going to have a chat, first of all, with Donna and Claire for about 30 minutes. And then, as I said, Cheryl will be back for about 15 minutes to pose your questions to the panel. So I hope that works for everybody. And we're going to dive right in. And Donna, I'm coming to you first. ASU, remarkable institution, really pioneering in so many ways, system-wide reform. Can you tell me a little bit about, it's hard, we've only got 40 minutes, but tell us a little bit about ASU, but perhaps more importantly, some of the challenges that you're tackling on behalf of tertiary education more generally.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words. And oh man, you did kind of pose a little bit of a challenge there. So let me take a crack at it and I'll look at the clock and see if I can do it fast. Arizona State University, we're a tier 1 research university. And part of what I think makes us really special is that we really lean into our charter. And the first line of our charter specifies that we judge ourselves not by who we exclude, but by who we include and how they succeed. And we really mean that. We have 162,000 students. This isn't just kind of figuring stuff out on the other side of COVID. We've been on a pretty accelerated path of access for a number of years. And about half of that are online students. And then we've got 5 campuses that represent the other half. So it's a really interesting challenge to figure out a mission of access and what that means. And frankly, this conversation is right at the heart of that mission. If we're going to produce access, if that's really what we're going to do, then we have to rethink the underlying structures. We have to think very differently about what are the credits coming in? How do you even, for a student for which access is a challenge, how do you reduce the friction and all the different places where that friction happens? Really, really, really core to the work that we do. We also tend to say yes to everything. So that puts us in a place where we're taking on projects that other campuses might not see in scope or may not necessarily see at the scale that we see. That also pushes us in places where we have to redefine our technology, look to technology partners like Badger to really try to figure out, okay, how do we shape this together? So it kind of frames how we think about corporate relationships or relationships with other institutions or international university relationships. So it's a really interesting place here at ASU. And frankly, it's fantastic to be able to have communities like the ones I'm watching, all the different locations that folks are located in. It's institutions like ours will be able to solve part of the problem, but it's in the diversity across higher ed and how we then come together and say, here's my take on the challenge. And then we can kind of rigorously look at things like badge standards and start figuring out what's it going to take to actually change the world.
Oh, that's absolutely brilliant, Donna. And so on behalf of the community, over the many years now, I just want to thank you and your institution for all of the incredible pioneering work, particularly in the area of access and inclusiveness. I think you've really set the bar for the rest of us to sort of live up to, and in doing so, I think you've created a ripple effect all the way around the world in terms of how innovation can drive access to quality tertiary education. So thank you. So your turn, Claire. Tell us a little bit about your institution, the system in which you operate, and maybe some of the challenges that you've focused on.
Sure. Thank you. The University of Maine system has 7 universities and a law school, and we enroll about 30,000, so much less than ASU students. Our system is separate from the Maine Community College system. They also have 7 campuses, but we do collaborate together. As an example, we had the first joint RFP for looking for a badging platform, and we both chose Badger Pro for that, but that was the first time that had ever been done. So our goal is to really try to think about micro-credentials across the state and create an ecosystem. So really building in the work that the community college system is doing with the University of Maine system, as well as with adult education and others across the state who are interested in this space of micro-credentials. Right now, for challenges, we are working on a unified accreditation plan. So we will have one accreditation for the whole system instead of 7 separate accreditations. So we're working through that plan right now. And that also is a first of its kind in the United States for a type of system like the University of Maine. Some challenges we are facing are similar challenges that everyone's facing in higher education today. Enrollment issues, retention, affordability, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I would even say the questioning of the value of a degree and how micro-credentials would fit into that. We also have economic challenges. We're a very rural state, so there's a lot of low income, first generation students. So those are some significant challenges. One particular challenge that we're working on is adult degree completion. And we have about 200,000 adult learners that have some college credit, but no credential. And out of our state has only 1.3 million people, so that's a significant number. So we'd like to get them to have a credential of value. So the state adopted the 60% attainment goal for adult learners to have a credential of value by 2025. And we have been improving in the last few years. We're now at 53%, and we were in the 40s earlier.
Oh, well done. Thank you, Claire. And then great to see the progress. A question for both of you, and I'll start with you, Donna. One of the number 1, 2, or 3 questions I get asked by change makers all around the world in this space of badging and alternative credentials of value. I like that, by the way, Claire. I love that credentials of value. I'm going to steal from you. I'm sorry. So I think that's a wonderful way of describing it. But I get asked the question, how do you get the governance, the executive of an institution to see this as strategically important? There's a lot of thousand flowers blooming initiatives, but I'd be really interested, Donna, to understand why ASU sees this as strategically important and how you got it on the radar of the governance and the executive of the institution to see it strategically important.
Yeah, that is a great question. And it didn't happen overnight. Our early efforts using badging that initiated in the libraries, because the libraries have a, well, you don't get credit for the kinds of things you learn using the libraries. And so the libraries wanted to work on things like fluency in knowledge acquisition, right? They're the whole sets of competencies that you learn from libraries. And they thought, well, we should badge these because you're not going to get course credit for the things that you learn. And then that kind of swelled at the point where learners were going to the libraries and were bragging and showcasing and sharing that they had research competencies, that they had new ways of demonstrating that they'd mastered learning through the kinds of things that the libraries had taught them. I think that really made everybody pause and take note. They're like, that's right, learning happens in all sorts of places. Some learning gets credit, but I like to think of it as let's give credit where credit is due. And then think of these kinds of tools as alternative ways of being able to celebrate that credit. So we had this groundswell, and it started, quite a few years ago, maybe 6 years ago. And over time, as that built up, as the students themselves taught us, because often they do, how they were going to use it, it gave us a little bit of a sense of, okay, so the technology works. Now we need to understand better, what does that mean for transforming a curricula? What does that mean for transforming a next generation transcript? So we've started a lot of proof of concepts, pilots with our digital high school, pilots with our local community college, just internally kind of nerdy pilots to say, we're just going to poke on CLR and the open badge standard and see where the limits are. It was out of probably 3 or 4 years of different types of pilots to build the coalition of the willing. And at that point, the mandate was a little bit easier because we were basically going and saying, this is how we see the activity. This is where we see the maturation of the technology. Here are enterprise tools like Badger that can kind of take some of the cognitive load off of, oh, how do we technically do it, to, oh, how do we think about pedagogies differently? As all of those things pulled together, it was not hard to get deans to say yes. And when we could directly map that to the challenge of access, to the challenge of, and I'm thinking, Claire, of the 200,000 students that you're talking about, we know the kinds of our enrollment officers, our admission officers, they know the kinds of challenges they face every day with these learners as they're exploring. And then when they melt, right, when they drop off the system because there's too much friction in it and we didn't actually get them to the place we want to go. As we were able to tell that narrative and start kind of strengthening our own hypotheses, it really was not as hard as it may seem, but we were intentional and frankly, we were pretty tenacious.
No, that is fantastic. And certainly my experience in driving innovation is start with the enlightened willing, the library where you're enlightened willing, the fence sitters kind of watch the enlightened willing. But when they see good things happening, they have a tendency to jump on the fence and join. And all of the naysayers, you just don't spend any time with them. You just go with the enlightened willing and the fence sitters that come along for the ride. And I think you've done well. I think what's important for people watching, Donna, though, to realize is then you made that direct connection to the access agenda, which is so near and dear to the heart of your executive governance and culture of ASU as well. So depending upon what the strategic intent is of the institution, being able to link those early stage pilots to the strategy of the institution is where it really starts to get the air cover that it needs as well. Claire, how did you manage to get it to register with your governance, with your executive as something strategically important?
Yeah, it is a great question. I feel that it came out of different areas. People were talking about what's this thing, what's a micro-credential, what's a digital badge? And they were curious and started to look at it, what can it do and how can we benefit from it? So initially I had started a program at UMaine called the Engage Black Bear, and the strategy there was to get students more engaged in the community and on campus. And so that was a retention goal. So I think that's what the provost was really excited about, that and wanted it to be used for retention. But as I moved into the system, it became a workforce development goal. And so we were hearing from all different places. So what we really wanted to be strategic about is alignment. How do we have everybody with a little bit different idea or a different understanding of what a micro-credential is or can do? How do we put that all together? And so we created a framework, and I can talk more about that later on, but I would say it happened through some grants that we did. We pulled together, we received a Lumina All Learning Counts grant, and that really helped with the ecosystem building. That grant was particularly for non-institutional learning for underserved populations in 4 different categories. So it was focused on equity. And so those 4 were low income, Native Americans, incarcerated, and our new Mainers, our immigrants and refugees. So there was a lot of interest across the state in serving and how best do we serve them, and maybe through micro-credentials and our alignment efforts, we could get further. And like earlier, thinking about this connecting of the dots, not have everybody do something very different or not reinventing the wheel, to really try to communicate with each other. So our board of trustees also was very interested in micro-credentialing and put it in as a major strategic priority.
Thank you, Claire. And have you found having that endorsement, having that support from your governance has helped you then make progress in your efforts?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think in both of those examples we've just heard about, you can see how linking in both of your cases access to an access and inclusiveness agenda has really helped bring others along for the ride. And I think it's often missed inside institutions that I work with, the power of alternative credentials or meaningful alternative credentials in actually opening up new pathways, inclusiveness, rounding out sort of the value proposition to the student that we'll talk about in a moment. Just for everybody listening, please put your questions in. As a question occurs to you, please type it in the chat. Cheryl's there watching and is going to make some choices around those to ask our panelists in just a few minutes. Donna and Claire, what I want to do now is sort of drop down a level and get into sort of the specifics around the way you're using digital badges to build a learning ecosystem. So the actual ways that you're doing it, if we can. Donna, can you maybe bring that to life for people a little bit, how you're using the digital badges themselves?
Sure. Well, a lot of the ways that I guess, if you go back a dozen years, only the innovators were doing and now seem kind of the norm, right? That we've got all sorts of, whether it's continuing education programs or actual courses that have badges deeply embedded inside them. But a lot of what we're trying to do, because we've got a pretty good, we call it ASU and Enterprise. It's kind of our version of handling the complexity that Claire, you have at your system. As you look across the diaspora of ASU, we've got lots of use of badges. So now we're starting to get to the point where we can say, okay, how do we start crafting narratives out of those and start really seeing the fruit of having an orchard full of different kinds of courses that are offering and different learning experiences that are offering it. So that's led us towards specific efforts like Pocket. And Pocket is our work towards a digital wallet. Inside that digital wallet, you see the things that come out of the student information system and Canvas. So it's showing you the things that look and act like a course and a transcript, the old world, if you will. But interspersed inside that experience are also open badges. And there you see us really experimenting with how do we start giving our learners different ways of framing their narratives and seeing these things side by side. And frankly, we don't know where the glory of that's going to come. We have a little over 100 students that are in an organization called the Learning Futures Collaborative. These are student workers. Okay, pause for a minute. Managing 120 student workers is its own magic. But they're arranged in guilds. I think there are 12 different guilds. Each of these guilds have identified in the work of creating a virtual world or UX design or any of the kinds of things that you might think are future workforce development for learning futures. They've got badges embedded inside of them. So that's a place where the students themselves and the student projects themselves are working alongside design teams to really then understand, okay, we've got this capability of badging. We've gotten pretty good at getting badges out there. Now, how do we represent them in things like a digital wallet? The Trusted Learner Network is looking, how do we get portability so that as we start understanding what they make sense inside of the ASU environment, we can also be collaborating and seeing how they make sense inside of a corporate environment or inside of a community college. So it's really trying to take these exemplars, and Claire, I'm thinking through the kinds of things that you've talked about too. Refugees is a great example. As you start understanding and having a bit of empathy with where that friction is for any given learner, then we can really start developing a proof of concept, roll those into pilots, and now we've got products. Some of those products actually come out this fall. So it really is a maturation.
That's fantastic. And we probably, Cheryl, should be thinking about having a whole webinar on this topic of a wallet, Donna, that you talk about. And because it is such a hot topic, it gets called different things in different parts of the world. But somebody described it to me the other day, Donna, as when we do that well and we do it with trust, it's sort of going to be that high resolution view of me or our students as individuals versus the very low resolution view that a historic transcript or testament gave. And I think that's a wonderful way of describing it, that our job here is to show the all-roundedness of the individual and what they've achieved and I think that's where the possibilities are endless for us to be able to create meaningful credentials and badges to bring that to life.
Yeah, Martin, 100%. And embedded maybe in the answer that I gave you before, let's build on the resolution idea a little bit. Not only do we have greater resolution into it, but we can also give you mechanisms by which you can then share that through a lens that makes sense to the people that you're sharing it to. So if you think of decades worth of accomplishments and portfolio pieces that you may have done 7 years ago, that were wonderful projects, and then you moved on and then suddenly become useful again because your career took a turn and you can draw on something from the past. Now it's a very different reality for you to be able to demonstrate the proof of concepts that you did, show the work that you did, show what companies you did that project with. So I love the notion of a high res. I also love the idea that we're starting to be able to get better creative suites for being able to really tell those stories.
Yeah, I agree. And as we've discussed, nations like mine, Australia right now at a national level is building a national credentials platform for every citizen to have their wallet. And of course, that opens up a whole, other dimension of how system reform could take place. So Claire, over to you now. We're in the area of the specific use of digital badges and how you're doing it. Can you bring that to life for us?
Sure. So we created the framework. I think that it all goes back to that. We wanted to tie things together. So it didn't matter where the content was coming from, as long as you collaborated and had a development team and you used that same framework, the micro-credential could be built. So I'll just briefly talk about the framework. It is 3 levels. So there's always an introductory badge that you earn, and then you move on. It's whatever it would be foundational, so you can get ready for more rigorous training. And at the level 2 badge, you would get that rigorous training, and it could be in the workshops, it could be a series of courses, it could be wherever it might, boot camp. And then you move on to the level 3, which is a more, it's always applied application. So you've learned this material, so how can you apply it in a real world setting, like an internship? And then we do have micro badges that you can embed, or industry recognized credentials, into the framework. So all 3 of those get stacked into the final micro credential. So having that framework has really been helpful for a lot of people in understanding the meaning for the University of Maine system. Everyone knows that just by the brand, or if you look at it, that there's going to be rigorous training, and there's going to be some experiential learning opportunity, and the students get evaluated from a supervisor on their activities within that and their skill development. So I think that that has been really helpful. So the Maine Community College system and our adult education, Maine Department of Education, adult education, has also adopted that framework. So that's why we're trying to build out this ecosystem. So we're looking at micro-credentials for our matriculated students, for youth, for aspirations, and to build a pipeline into the University of Maine system, higher ed. And then we have some for adult learners. And then we have some professional development, more employee upskilling, reskilling micro-credentials.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And I think frameworks are really important when you're trying to drive broad-based adoption, because I sort of think of them as a little bit of guardrails as well. And something that you talked about, Claire, at the end of the day, if it's your institution or your state or your system that is putting their brand and their reputation on the credential, on the badge, I do think it's important for there to be some standards or frameworks that sit behind it. But I also think it's really important, to Donna's point around the pedagogy, that actually as an educator, I've always appreciated frameworks, because it gave me the building blocks of how I could do my instructional design and my pedagogy. And I think there's a tension that emerges then between how do you not stifle creativity, but how do you provide enough definition in the framework so that the system and the individuals within the system, or the stakeholders that benefit from it, can make sense of what these new creatures are that are emerging in the tapestry of tertiary education. I'm not sure, Donna, if you wanted to perhaps reflect a little bit on this notion of frameworks and your views around it.
I totally agree. And I'm very, well, I don't think that it's by accident that there are a couple different industries for which understanding credentials is moving faster. So the conversations inside of colleges of pharmacy or nursing, engineering colleges. In my world as Chief Information Security Officer, I get to see and partner with a lot of groups that are trying to look at cybersecurity. And it really is interesting to think about the frameworks there, because on the industry side, there are quite rigorous frameworks that we are mapping directly in. And so we get this nice experimental playground where there's just enough formation, there's just enough scaffolding, just enough rules, just enough sense that we're talking a common language, that we can start mapping not only the accomplishments that go in the credentials, but if they're machine readable, there's all sorts of other kind of metadata you can put in there too. We can start looking at them across each other, clustering them together. That leads into the conversations a lot of us are having around skills, and then being able to recombine them again, because they're machine readable, so that you can map them in frameworks in ways that would have just been really hard and unexpected to do before. So, forgive me, except for I'm not going to really ask for forgiveness. I'm a CISO. Like, cybersecurity is a really interesting place to try to play with that, because we know that we want to demonstrate mastery. So in my world as a both on the academic side and then on the CISO side, if I can create projects on campus where I engage students that may or may not be cybersecurity students in threat hunting, that I can engage them directly in trying to help me keep my environment safer against phishing or smishing or any of the other ways bad guys get in. And why not give badges that show mastery for those students who actually helped us fend off the bad guys, who learned something along the way and now have demonstrably stronger skills in a space of digital trust and a space of cybersecurity. Not all cybersecurity jobs are going to be ones for which you get degrees. They're going to happen in marketing and all sorts of other places. So I think these different frameworks kind of give us a scaffold by which we can then say, okay, how do we take this particular set and this particular set and play in really exciting ways?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. All right, my final question, and then I'm handing over to my buddy Cheryl. So I'll go to you, Claire. Biggest lessons learned. If you were starting out now, if you were starting again all over again, what would be the things that you would absolutely do again? And what would be the things that you might have done a different way, Claire?
Yeah, it's hard to start. We started in 2015 when there was hardly any information. There wasn't a lot of ideas around it. We just had to kind of go in and try it and see what happened. So I'm very thankful that we did have the framework right from the start, and we kept with that. And that seems to be working. It makes sense to a lot of people. It decreases that level of confusion, like I said, about what is a micro-credential. There's a set place that you can follow along and create your whatever you're creating to the end. So I would say understanding your why is the biggest one right from the start. Why do you want to develop micro-credentials? And thinking about who your target audiences are, and then thinking how do you best meet them where they are. But starting with your why, you really kind of need that focus initially before jumping right in. So let's develop these. I say find your champions. You called them, what was it?
Enlightened willing.
And what I found too, that is as many champions as you can in all the stakeholder categories. Get as many people on board early on, because they will come and go. I have definitely had that feeling of the great resignation, where you build this partnership and you have people who are on your side and partnering with you, and then they leave for another position. So it's a constant education process where you need outreach and education. So really just go broad with your champions as far out as you can. And then we know micro-credentials take time and effort. So coming up with some kind of incentives for faculty and staff and really explaining the benefits is important. Linking it into tenure and promotion if possible for faculty, or compensating them with mini grants for their time. I think those are the three that I would say.
And they are all brilliant, and I agree with absolutely every one of them. So thank you. Donna, your turn. Lessons learned.
Oh, so many. I do think that really having clarity when you partner about what your value alignment is, what is it that you're in it for, and what is it that they're in it for, and making sure that you revisit that, and that you're both really honest with each other about what you're trying to accomplish. That's really important, because if you are a university and a community college, we both have all sorts of things that we need to accomplish and do, and all sorts of challenges that we come up with. Or if you are partnering with a corporate entity, or if you're partnering with a software vendor so that you can create a new thing. Somewhere along all those lines are plenty of paths where your thoughts might diverge, where the set of goals and initiatives shifts for all sorts of reasons, because the landscape is shifting. So if there's one thing, I'd say build those relationships such that you have really early and often iterations of how's our alignment doing and how do we fit. And then be really honest with yourself and say, it's okay, we don't have to do this right now. We certainly have encountered along the way. We learned through a proof of concept and we realize, oh my goodness, there's just not the capacity with our partner to be able to do the next step, which is no fault. We need to go into a fundraising effort and figure out how are we going to get that high school with the right kinds of funding to be able to take that next step, because readiness is really important. So not holding too near or dear to what you think the end game looks like, but being really tenacious about let's learn, let's stop, say, okay, where are we? If there's a challenge there that's a resource challenge or a funding challenge or whatever, that you then say, okay, we're going to tackle that one, and then be okay with the fact that the process takes a while. That's really where I think the, I don't know, it's kind of a contact sport of getting out there and trying to make innovation happen.
Yeah, look, I'm so thankful you said that. One of the things I've observed when I've been working with institutions of all sizes is they get to a point of paralysis, Donna, because they try to make it perfect at the get-go, and so they just start spinning, and it sort of wears everybody out. And so your idea of understand the why, be really clear on the parameters, but get going and iterate, and then pause, look at it, refine, move forward. That I think is really very powerful for people that are watching. It's sort of that just get started. And you've both explained that's how it worked for you. You had your vision, you understood the why clear, you knew what you were trying to achieve, but at a certain point, you took the risk to walk through the door and get going, and to iterate along the way, and to bring others with you in that journey along the way. And Claire, that idea of incentives, I think is very important. I think it's really important that people are given recognition, they're given resources as and when appropriate, they're listened to. All of those things create a bow wave then that ultimately leads to system reform. Cheryl, I noticed that we've got a couple of questions coming in. Laurie, thank you for putting one in there. So I'm going to invite Cheryl back on camera now and hand it to you, Cheryl, to ask Donna and Claire some of the questions coming through, or something that might be on your mind.
Yeah, this is a great question. I couldn't have phrased it even any better than this. Are there standards for what's considered badge worthy, or an official micro-credential, or what do you do to determine that a course or set of courses meet that criteria?
So we'll go to Claire first on that, and then to you, Donna.
Yes, great question. It goes back to understanding your objectives for, is it badge worthy? In our case, we knew right from the start, we did not want to have a participation badge. We really wanted our badges to be competency based and to have standards and assessments, authentic assessments attached to it. So that's where we were coming from. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Donna.
No, I agree. I think this really requires what we're trying to determine value for a thing that hasn't existed before. We have a sense that there's value there. As from a technology point, like it's easy to extrapolate what that value could be, but you don't really know until you get it out there. So back to Martin's point about, how we feel about our experimentation, we recognize the value when we start actually working right alongside learners. Those learners are actually using them for different things. We're trying not to be precious about what value is supposed to look like, but more very pragmatic and saying, okay, this appears to actually have some traction to it. It's maybe we have metrics in terms of students and their ability to accelerate themselves through a learning pathway, or maybe it's the conversion of a student's experience into partnerships that we might have. Whatever your metrics might be, we're trying to then think of it as a design question as to how do we determine whether or not that's working, and then through that say, okay, now we're getting a better appreciation for what that value looks like. So I realize that, Laurie, that it would be really nice if we could point to a common standard. And I think we are trying to be really respectful of existing accreditation standards and existing industry certificates. When we can partner directly with those and really use those as a known so that we can better interrogate the unknown, that's I think where we get the most effective sense of moving forward in traction.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. And there are some wonderful pieces of work. Professor Beverly Oliver formerly of Deakin University, has led some wonderful work in Europe and Australia, coming up with some definitions around micro-credentials and some of the parameters that you might want to take on board as you define them for yourself, Laurie, or for your institution. So, there are places you can go to look at how other people have defined standards that might help inform the way you then want to do it. Back to you, Cheryl.
Well, one thing I just wanted to kind of make a comment too, because I know in having this conversation with other people thinking about strategic intent, that you can start this work. And I think both you, Donna and Claire, did this where it came up organically on campus. At the same time that those types of skunk works are happening, having convenings across campus where you are finding those enlightened willing and having those kinds of groups to find out where there's momentum, that can be the origin of strategic intent. And the thing that's so fascinating to me about this work is obviously you can issue a badge for anything, but you can't always guarantee that will have value for everything. And so the strategic intent phrase sounds like it's a top-down thing. And obviously there's a little bit of that when you start getting into some of the constraints around this, but it's really a bottom-up, top-down at the same time, and then a lot of iterating. Even though we use that language of strategic intent, it sounds like there's the dictate coming from above. But I have found in almost everybody I've talked to about these kinds of initiatives that they really do bubble up, come from the side, come from outside, come from inside. They're really not the same kind of strategic I think of when I'm thinking about something happening across campus.
Yeah. All right, Cheryl, we've probably got time for one last question before we wrap up. Was there anything else that came through that you'd like to pose?
There's a couple questions, and these are probably easier ones to answer, but where, I know people have asked me this before too, where does it sit on campus for you? Is there a person who has a role who's overlooking, or a group that's sort of in charge? How do you sort of govern the strategic part of it?
Yeah, Claire, how are you governing it? Where does it sit? Who gets paid to do it?
So with when it was just on one campus at the University of Maine, it was the provost office and academic affairs. And then with this, now that it moves to the system, it is in academic affairs for at the chancellor's, vice chancellor's office.
Very good. And roughly what number of people would be devoted to it, Claire?
So I have myself and a part-time staff, and then one above me, the associate vice chancellor is very heavily involved.
Okay,
and then we have everybody who's developed a micro-credential. So
part of the group.
We have a steering committee as well, so that's really important, and it's representatives from all the campuses. We're building out a statewide steering committee as well, so that'll be more for our agencies, our government agencies.
Thank you. Donna, how are you doing it, resourcing it and leading it?
Well, like many things with ASU, there are millions of flowers that are blooming all over the campus. So one of our challenges is to try to understand, where do you need to have focal points that bring together governance and have some hard questions. So those tend to pull together with a couple big, I'd call them nodes in a network. There are roles inside the provost's office that think deeply about this and are very engaged from the kind of perspectives you would expect from a provost, but also because it's the provost, some of our outcomes and our ability to actually see analytics are sitting right alongside in her office. So really important nexus point there. I'm in the University Technology Office, and it really, a lot of our technologists are dedicated to this. We've got an entire team and a champion. They have instructional designers that are coming with a technology-enabled frame for how they think about it. They work in partnership with online directors. These are technology directors that do a lot of online coursework because we're ASU, but then also offer that in lots of varieties of ways inside their colleges. So each of those, each college has somebody, and they all then come together. We've got a number of different types of governance committees where they pull together and think about how we're doing this. And that may look a little bit different based on the campus and what its ambitions are. But it is kind of a, I think the network model is probably the best way to describe it. The really important thing that we've learned as we've gone through that is how to be able to signal which node in the network is moving forward with what idea, so that oh, I want to be able to present this badge in some place that's an unusual place. Where do I go? I go over there. Or, oh, I've got an accreditation challenge. Where do I go? I know who in the provost's office to go to. So you've got to get pretty good at having each node be self-aware and being able to declare, here's the thing I'm doing. If you want to throw the ball in my direction, I can catch it. If not, I can help you find the next person who can help you with the problem you're trying to tackle.
Brilliant. Thank you. All right, folks. Well, sadly, we're out of time for today, but if I can give a huge thank you to Donna, Claire, and also to you, Cheryl, for partnering with me in these webinars. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I got a lot of takeaways that I'm going to build into my bag of tricks as I help people all around the world implement alternative credential and badging programs. Thank you for tuning in with us. I hope you all take very good care, and we'll see you in webinar number 4. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.